Yeah, so I've started the. You could just wait for 1 minute for some people to join in and then we can start. So Mia, you can start. There are attendees already joining in. Yeah.
Hello, and a very warm welcome to everyone for today's PSDRN, or Private Sector Development Research Network seminar series, which will focus on labor markets. Today's seminar will be hosted by International Growth Center, or IGC, which is a member organization at PSDRN. I am Samiha, a policy economist working with the Firms Initiative at IGC London. For those of you who are new to the seminar or are probably attending it for the first time, PSDRN is a research network consisting of a group of organizations, including development finance institutions, think tanks, and academic institutions actively supporting research on private sector development, an essential aspect of which is the intersection of labor markets, human capital, and job creation. You can follow the PSDRN seminar series for this year in the website. The details of that will be posted on the chat box. The host for today's session is IGC. We are a research institution co-directed by London School of Economics and Political Science and the University of Oxford. IGC's purpose is to improve the use of evidence in policy making through frontier research. IGC functions through its country offices, which are mainly in Asia and Africa. Our areas of research encompasses the themes of energy, state, cities, firms, and tax. You can read more about IGC's work in our website. Coming to today's seminar, for which all of us have been waiting with a lot of excitement, we are very honored to have with us Professor Vittorio Bassi. Vittorio Bassi is an assistant professor of economics at the University of Southern California in the United States of America. His research focuses on private sector development and labor markets in developing economies. You can read more about Professor Vittorio's research, the details of which will be posted on the chat box. We're excited to have him here with us today, and we'll hear from him about tackling youth unemployment, evidence from a labor market experiment in Uganda. So before we pass to him, I will quickly review a few housekeeping rules. All attendees have been muted for this seminar to minimize background noise. If you have any questions, please type them into the Q&A box, and you can access the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. We're going to have a designated time at the end of the seminar to answer questions. Please make sure to include your full name and organizational affiliation along with your questions so that we can identify you. We are recording today's session, and a video and audio recording will be made available in PSDRN's website. You can go back and check them on the website and share with your network. I would also like to tell you that there will be a brief survey immediately following today's presentation, so please take a minute to fill that out. Your feedback is very important to us. Please feel free to contribute to the conversation on Twitter by using hashtag vocational training jobs Uganda. So without further ado, I'll now pass to Professor Vittorio. The floor is yours, Professor Vittorio.
Hi, and thank you very much, Samiha. I think I'll go ahead and share my screen then and start the presentation. Thanks for the very nice introduction. So can you see the screen?
Yes, I can see your screen.
Okay, so hi everyone. Thanks a lot for inviting me. In this project, we will discuss the long-term impacts of vocational training on young unemployed youth in Uganda and the role of vocational training in building resilience to macroeconomic shocks over the life cycle. So this project is very new, so I look forward to your thoughts and feedback. This is joint with Livia Alfonsi, who's just finishing her PhD at UC Berkeley, with Ima Rasool at the UCL, and Elena Spadini, who's at the USC and at our partner research firm in Uganda, Dyadic Research Impacts. So the motivation for this project is that young people face a higher risk of unemployment than adults in all areas of the world. So young people are more likely to be unemployed. And this is particularly true in developing countries, and in particular in East Africa, due to very skewed age distributions. So for example, in East Africa, the setting of our study, 60% of the population is below the age of 25. And so every year you have masses of young workers that are trying to enter the labor market, and helping them enter the labor market is a key policy challenge. And such challenges become even more pressing since the onset of the COVID pandemic. This is a graph from the ILO that shows the change in global hours worked relative to be just before the pandemic began. So we normalize at zero here just before the pandemic starts in end of 2019. And we see that there was a sharp drop in global hours worked. Of course, these are estimates during the pandemic. The best estimates we have is that during 2020 alone, over 250 million jobs were lost. To put this into perspective, this is 4 times the 2009 financial crisis. And then, of course, there's been a recovery. We know that, but the recovery has been slow. And so even today, we're still below pre-pandemic levels in terms of global hours worked. And again, the ILO estimates that the youth have been the most affected. So when we think about how we're going to solve this youth unemployment problem, that's become even more salient in recent years. Vocational training is a common policy tool that has been used around the world to tackle this problem. And the key idea of vocational training is to try and help to facilitate the transition from school to work. So usually vocational trainees receive training in institutes, learning a practical trade, a sector-specific trade. At the either they have dropped out of school, they finished high school, and vocational training is meant to help that transition into the labor market by providing sector-specific skills. And there is pretty good evidence by now that at least in the sort of short to medium run, so looking at a time frame of 1 to 3 years, high quality vocational training can be effective at facilitating that transition and increasing employment and earning. However, when you think about the cost-benefit analysis of these programs, typically because these programs are quite expensive, the cost-benefit analysis requires very strong assumptions on what's going to happen to the evolution of benefits over the life cycle of individuals. And so there are 2 open questions, I think, around the impact of vocational training programs and related interventions. The first is about the long run effects. So how long lasting are these benefits to workers? And do these benefits also extend to creating resilience to shocks the individuals might go through over the life cycle? And in particular, here we're going to look at the role of macroeconomic shocks, in particular the one of COVID. And so of course, the answers are important to inform cost-benefit analysis, but also more of these programs, but also more broadly to understand the role of skills and the role of human capital, the role of the skills and human capital play over the life cycle. So what we're going to show in this paper are going to be the impacts of vocational training and related job search assistance interventions on Ugandan youth up to 9 years since the interventions took place and throughout the COVID-19 pandemic. So to give you a little bit of overview before jumping into the meat of the paper, we're going to leverage an RCT where we originally randomized over 1,000 young workers into vocational training using an experimental design. So the baseline took place in 2012. Okay, so this is when the study began. And then in 2013, the interventions took place, in particular the offer to workers of vocational training. This is the main intervention. And then in separate papers that we have already written, we document that these interventions had a positive employment learning impact up until 5 years after the treatment. So the contribution of this new piece of work is to go back to the same sample of workers and survey them again in late 2020, late 2021, and early 2022. Okay, so this is going to be up to 10 years after baseline and throughout the COVID pandemic. That of course affected also Uganda. So Uganda, as many other countries, went through a period of lockdowns. There were 2 lockdowns in 2020 and 2021. And so in each of the surveys that we do, we survey the workers and ask them about their outcomes just before the lockdown, during the lockdown, and just after the lockdown for 2 lockdowns. And this allows us to trace the dynamics of the employment and earnings impacts of vocational training throughout the pandemic period. And to speak to the mechanisms of why vocational training might affect differently workers during this period, we also track a representative sample of over 2,000 SMEs in the same sectors in which the workers receive training. And this allows us to speak to the role of labor demand channels and firm behavior channel in explaining some of the returns to vocational training over this period. And so the key results are, first of all, long-term impacts. We find that vocational training still had positive effects on labor market outcomes over 7 years since the interventions were implemented, so in early 2020, just before the crisis. Then during the COVID pandemic, we find that vocational trainees were actually more affected negatively by the lockdowns. But also, and this is going to be very important, they recover more quickly than the control group of workers who did not receive vocational training. And then exploring the mechanisms, we find that this is because vocational trainees have been shifted by the training towards sectors that are more formal and more exposed to the macroeconomic shock. But also vocational training, through the formality of training and the role of and certification of skills that is provided to workers, allows them to more quickly jump back, say, on the job ladder and facilitate labor market mobility, which then allows them to find jobs more quickly than the control group who did not receive training. And of course, I'll talk about these results in more detail, but let me start by telling you a little bit about the sample, experimental design, and data that we collected for this project. So we worked in a representative in a sample of urban labor markets throughout Uganda. So this is where the study takes place. And as I said, we have both workers and firms. So on the worker side, the youth were initially identified through applications that they made to BRAC. BRAC is a large NGO, it's one of the largest NGOs in the world, and the largest, definitely the largest NGO in Uganda. So BRAC offered vocational training scholarships, and so youth were identified because they applied for this vocational training scholarship. And the scholarship was to receive vocational training for a period of 6 months, and I'll tell you a little bit more about the specifics of the training. Now, these scholarships were advertised, so people could apply, but in order to apply, individuals had to be disadvantaged youth. And so there was a poverty assessment that was made upon application. And so consistent with this, when we look at who applied, these are as expected, young workers. They are on average 20 years old. So these are precisely the types of people that we would like to try and help enter the labor market through vocational training. So they're out of school, so they've completed some school, but they've dropped out of high school typically, and they haven't gone back to school. And their employment rate in this sample that applies for these scholarships, in line again with the selection criteria of being poor, is 60%. So 60% of them are unemployed at baseline. And if they are employed, they mostly do casual sort of itinerant work, literally like collecting wood or water or something that we don't think can lead to a path out of poverty. So as expected, like more people apply to these programs than scholarships were available. And so we're going to exploit an oversubscription design to assign some of the extra applicants to vocational training and some to a control group. And so again, the sectors where training takes place, these are typical sectors where we think instead there could be a path out of poverty. These are sectors that can provide meaningful work, that can provide an opportunity to accumulate human capital and utilize that human capital in a productive way. And so these are going to be sectors such as construction, welding, electrical wiring, plumbing, tailoring, hairdressing, catering, that constitute sort of the meat of the SME sector in a country like Uganda. So on the firm side, I said we also follow a representative sample of firms. These are firms in the same training sector. So they're going to be firms in these 8 sectors. And these are SMEs, kind of, that typically have 3 workers on average, but they do provide, by Ugandan standards, pretty good wage and stable employment. So the idea of vocational training is to try and shift these individuals from these itinerant casual work into these meaningful sectors. So this is the design of the experiment. As I said, we have more workers apply to these scholarships than scholarships are available. So through a first random assignment of the 1,700 workers that apply, some are offered vocational training. And then I'll describe in the next slide what the vocational training entails exactly. Now, of the ones that go through vocational training, here at the top, a first group is randomized into just then, entering the labor market and looking for jobs by themselves. And then so this is the first group. So this is the business as usual of vocational training, where vocational training centers are paid to train workers, but not to find them jobs. So the workers go through the training and then they have to look for a job. The second group, instead, we add to the vocational training also a light touch job search assistance intervention. So upon graduation from the Vocational Training Institute, BRAC, the NGO that provided the scholarships and paid for the training, tries to give a light touch help to the workers in finding a job. And I'll tell you exactly how we do that in the next slide. And then of the workers that are randomized out of vocational training that don't get the offer to start, we have a control group that is going to be used in the analysis. And then there are other treatments that we're not going to discuss today, other groups, but these are part of of our previous research agenda and previous papers that we've written on this program. So for today, the main comparison is going to be between individuals that got vocational training with or without the job search assistance component versus a control group of workers that are observational equivalent at baseline, but they were not offered the opportunity to start vocational training by random assignment. So again, vocational training, to be clear, this is an intense, high-quality intervention where workers are offered the opportunity to receive training at a formal training institute in their region for a period of 6 months. BRAC is paying fully the cost of the training, which is about $500 per worker. And I'll show you this is order of magnitude higher than what these workers could afford on their own. And so what's important, of course, this is formal training. So you're going, workers are going to a high quality institute, they're receiving formal training, they're receiving transcripts, they're receiving certification. The matching intervention that we do on top of this is very simple. We collect some basic details of the workers that go through the training, such as their names, and we put together a very stylized CV, and then we circulate the CV among SMEs in the same sectors and in the same region, and ask the SMEs if they're interested in interviewing some of these workers. This happens right at the end of training. And then BRAC helps those firms that are interested in meeting workers in setting up the interview. But that's all the help that there is. There is no wage subsidy. There is no, firms don't get paid to hire the workers. We just facilitate the meeting between workers and firms at the end of training. So this is the study timeline. So as I said, we start in 2012. So this project has been going on for a while. When the trainees apply and we have a baseline survey, so then the interventions take place in 2013. Then we have 7 follow-up surveys. Now, we first of all follow up with the workers every year until 2016. So this is a 3-year period. Then we survey them again after 5 years. That's in 2018. And then there is the period of COVID here that starts in 2020, where we have the first national lockdown that I'll describe. And then we went back right after the first lockdown. So this is now 8 years since the baseline. And we asked workers about their outcomes just before the COVID shock, during the lockdown, and right after the lockdown. And then we do the same later in the 6th follow-up, which happens in 2021. That happens right after the second lockdown that took place in Uganda in 2021. And so again, here at 6th follow-up, we asked the workers their outcomes just before the 2021 lockdown, during the lockdown, and after the lockdown. And finally, to better understand the recovery period, we also surveyed the workers in February 2022, which is now 10 years since the baseline. To clarify, of course, this project is part of an agenda that is ongoing. And so follow-ups 1 to 3, and to some extent follow-up 4 have already been used in previous papers that are cited here. So the new parts really that I'm going to focus on today are really going to be these follow-ups number 5 to 7, following workers from 8 years to 10 years after baseline, and looking at the impacts of vocational training and the job search assistance over this period. But I'll use a little bit also the previous follow-ups to set the scene a little bit. So it's important, to understand the interventions and the returns to these interventions is critical to pay a little bit of attention to what was happening to economic growth in Uganda over this period. So here on the left-hand side, we show the graph of GDP per capita in Uganda. From 2000 to 2020, the red line is when our study begins. So you see that Uganda went through a very fast period of growth between 2000 and 2010. Then the growth slowed somewhat between 2010 and 2020, but it was still positive growth. And so you should think of our study having taken place primarily during a period of growth, but not like exceptional growth, which is the period between 2010 and 2020. But then if you look at the last point here, 2020, this is the only year over this period when the GDP per capita actually fell in Uganda. And this is because of the lockdowns and because of the COVID-related economic disruptions. So you can look at the same graph in terms of growth rate, and you see that 2020 is the only year where actually we have negative growth rate in terms of GDP per capita. And so again, we're going to be able to look at what happens to returns to vocational training and job search assistance intervention during a period of growth, and then how this changes during a period of downturn, which I think is a key innovation of the study. So to give you a word on the lockdowns, so what happened in developing countries, including Uganda, is that as soon as the COVID pandemic began, these countries started to mimic a little bit what countries in Europe and the US were doing in terms of lockdowns, even though at least initially the case count was lower in these countries. And so Uganda went into a hard lockdown in 2020. It was a nationwide lockdown that lasted a couple of months. And it affected precisely the kinds of businesses that we've talked about. So these non-essential businesses, such as motor mechanics, such as welding, such as hairdressing, were heavily affected. They had to remain closed for a few weeks. There was curfews, there was public transportation suspensions. And so this, of course, could have affected the workers in our sample. There was, this is important for our study, there was no systematic help for small and medium enterprises in this context. So there was no such thing as like wage subsidies or anything like that. What there was, of course, was some food distribution to the urban poor and some like basic assistance to poor individuals, but this was not dependent on the kind of employment that people had. So we shouldn't think of, the workers receiving different kinds of assistance from the government depending on their job status within our sample. And then, of course, there was the reopening starting from June 2020, was a little, gradual reopening. And then in 2021, again, Uganda went into a second hard lockdown, very similar to the first lockdown, again, for a period of a couple of months. Anecdotal evidence says that this was less strictly enforced, and we're gonna find that in our data. And throughout, of course, there was, of course, a health emergency in Uganda as well as in almost every other country of the world. Compared, however, to the kinds of numbers that we've seen in Europe or the US, the case count remained, it's fair to say, lower in Uganda, especially when it comes to COVID-related deaths. So this is just something to keep in mind, that I think a lot of the disruptions were of an economic nature more than a health nature, at least in a comparative sense with other countries. So what kind of information we collect? So we survey the workers over the phone. I mean, of course, this was the only thing that we could do over this period where, of course, in-person surveys were not permitted or were not recommended, at least. And so we collect all the standard information that allows us to trace the impacts on employment and earnings, so employment status, sector of employment, and so on. What's important, we're also going to ask questions about the transitions the workers make in the labor market, right? Whether they move from a job to unemployment, from unemployment to jobs, or between jobs. And this is going to help us understand why workers might be resilient to these macroeconomic shocks. Then we have plenty of survey questions on search effort, direction, savings, assets, borrowing behaviors that might again speak to the mechanisms of resilience over this period. And then questions about the perceived strength of lockdowns and experiences of the pandemic. So coping strategies, expectations, and family constraints that individuals might have over this period. And then, as I said, we also survey firms. We surveyed the firms after the first lockdown, so twice, end of 2020, early 2021. And here the main aim of these firm surveys is to understand the mechanisms that might have led to resilience of the workers. And so the survey of firms really is going to look at particularly what happens to employment in these firms over this period. Do they fire workers? Which workers do they fire? Which workers do they rehire? What are the labor flows in these firms by skill type? And does that help us understand kind of why vocational training might have built resilience over this period? So the estimation strategy is very simple. We're going to estimate ITT effects of both the vocational training treatment and vocational training plus matching treatment. And so the comparison group here is going to be the control group. And we follow otherwise the specifications that we have in previous papers, where and today we're only going to estimate impacts wave by wave. So we're going to estimate impacts, before the lockdowns, during the lockdowns, right after the lockdowns, and so on. And so I think everything else is quite standard. We control for some basic worker characteristics at baseline, and we control for the baseline value of the outcome variable whenever it is available. But I'll show you the results wave by wave. And so this is going to average over everybody that was assigned to vocational training matching control. So are going to be intention to treat impacts. So just again, to summarize here, this is the balance table of the outcomes of the workers at baseline. So this is how the workers are looking at baseline. And this is the control group here, this first row. Again, what you see is that 60% of the workers are unemployed at baseline, so did not do any work at all in the last month. And when you look at what kind of work they're doing, not very much regular wage employment, extremely little self-employment, a lot of casual work. So this is precisely what I was saying at the beginning. We're starting from a baseline where individuals are involved in very itinerant, low-paying casual occupations. They're earning only $5 a month, which, if you remember, the cost of the training is $500 a month. So again, this is order of magnitudes lower in terms of earnings than what the workers could, than the cost of the training. So really think that the training is solving a credit constraint issue where workers would not be able to pay this training by themselves. So we follow the workers. Of course, we have some attrition that was expected. So this is an attrition table where the dependent variable is whether the worker has attrited in different waves. And then we regress this on the same specification that I showed you before. So dummies for whether you've been assigned to one of the treatments, and then some baseline controls. So you see is that in wave 4, we don't. So first of all, we have close to 30% attrition by the last follow-up. I think, this number is, of course, is a little high, but it's also expected given that we're trying to follow up with workers 10 years since the baseline with phone surveys over a pandemic. What's of course worth noticing here is that up to wave 4, we don't see that the treatments predict whether you attrit from the sample. We do start to see that workers in the treatment groups are less likely to attrit by the last rounds of follow-ups. This was expected to some extent. Of course, we have better contact information for these workers that went through the training, and they might have stronger reasons to keep in touch with us, given that BRAC paid for the training. I don't have time to go into details, but of course we have to deal with this potentially selective attrition, and so the main thing that we do is to check that the predictors of attrition at baseline, so the characteristics of individuals that predict whether the individual attrits from the sample, don't differentially predict attrition in the treatment groups. So that is equivalent to saying that we check that the sample remains balanced on observable characteristics at follow-up. And so we find the evidence that this is the case. And so there is no differential attrition based on baseline characteristics across treatment groups, which tells us that even though, of course, there's been some attrition, the sample, this is consistent with the sample having remained comparable on baseline characteristics between treatment and control groups at follow-up, and so the experiment still being valid. But of course, we have in the paper a bigger discussion of how we deal with this selective attrition. So for today, we're going to control for characteristics that do predict attrition and could predict attrition differentially by survey wave. So these baseline characteristics, but then other than that, we are not going to do other adjustments. And of course, there is more robustness checks that we could do on this point. But let me just show you, in the interest of time, let me get to some of the results. So before showing the results on the dynamics of impacts during the crisis, let me look at the long-term impacts of these interventions up until the eve of the pandemic, so up until 2020. So the first thing that we document is the vocational training, as expected or as hoped, raises the skills of workers. And if you think about the theory of change for why these programs should work, the first thing we want to validate is that vocational training increases the skills of the individuals. So let's focus on column 2 here, just for the interest of time in the middle. Here, the dependent variable is a score that goes from 0 to 100. There is the result of a factor-specific skill test that we implemented with all the workers in all the treatment groups at the follow-up number 3. This is the last point, so about 3 years after the training, when we measure the skills of the workers directly. And so what you see here, these are coefficients for more or less regressions and standard errors. You see that vocational training increased the skills of the workers on the 0 to 100 measure by about 5 to 7 points, which is equivalent to about 0.2 to 0.4 of a standard deviation of the test score in the control group. So these are large effects on skills. It means the vocational training really increased the skills of individuals that went through the training. And the effect is very similar, and this is throughout the table, and these are additional measures of skills. It's very similar between the vocational trainees and the vocational training that also received the matching intervention. This is also expected, given that they went through the same training. It's just that the second group also got some help in the end of searching for jobs, but we would expect the impacts on human capital accumulation to be similar, and indeed this is what we find. So then when we look at the impacts on employment and earnings of these interventions, at wave 4, this is in 2018, this is 5 years after the treatments, we see that there continues to be, up to that point, positive impacts of these interventions, of both interventions on employment and earnings. So starting from column 4 here at the beginning, we see that there is some effect on the extensive margin probability of being employed in a wage or self-employment. This is at the margin of significance, and it corresponds to about a 13 to 18% increase in employment. So there is some effect on the extensive margin, but the biggest effect that we find on the employment margin is on which sectors the workers are working on. So here in column 5, you see very large effects on the probability of working in one of these 8 skilled good jobs, good sectors. You see that the mean in the control group is 2.2. So 20% of the workers in control group have managed to find a job in one of these 8 sectors. This probability goes up by 50%, by 0.1 to 0.13 in the treatment group. So really, the treatment is shifting workers from casual occupations to more skilled trade sectors. And as a result of that, we find the impacts on earnings in column 6 of having been assigned 5 years before to vocational training. And these effects, or vocational training and matching, and these effects are large for both interventions. We're looking at an impact of 17 to 21%. So these are quite large impacts. And if you look at where the earnings are coming from, they really come from earnings in self-employment or wage employment, not in casual work, right? So we see that the workers we have increased their involvement into skilled wage or self-employment, and this has allowed them to earn more money than the control groups. And when we look at the impacts, we can also, of course, compute cumulative impacts since the beginning of wave one, and we find that these effects are in the same order of magnitude, a little bit higher. So there is a small decrease in the magnitude of the treatment effects over time, but still these are pretty large by wave 4 by any standard. So now so here we should pause for a second and think about, how does the vocational training intervention compare to the vocational training plus matching? And actually they, as you can see, they're very similar. So we can already, throughout the table, the effects are comparable. They're not statistically different. And so what this is telling us is that 5 years after the treatment, there is no longer an additional effect of matching over vocational training. And so at this point, we are going to, for the rest of the analysis, we're going to pull together these two groups to improve power, of course, because we have higher attrition in the last rounds. So from this point on, I'm only going to show you the combined effect of pooled vocational training plus matching, given that the effects of the two interventions are indistinguishable from a statistical point of view. So now getting to the pandemic, and so we've established, up to 5 years after the treatment, there are still large effects of vocational training. Now, what happens just before and during the pandemic? So what am I going to show you here? Well, let's start with pictures. So on the x-axis, we have the follow-up wave. So here, the first point is going to be wave 4. This is what I just showed you. This is 2018. Then this point here, W5 pre, this is February 2020, is just before the lockdown. Then we have during the first lockdown, that's the gray bar. Then just after the first lockdown. And then we have before the second lockdown here, W6 pre, during the second lockdown, after the second lockdown, and finally wave 7, which is in February 2022. And so the blue line are the outcomes, just the mean and confidence interval of the mean for the treatment group. And the red line is the control group. So what you see on the purely extensive margin of the probability of doing any work, as we started saying before, there is not much difference anymore by 5 or 6 up to 8 years after treatment between the treatment and the control group. But why is that? Well, because even in the control group, eventually workers manage to find some job. And so if you look at the y-axis here, like 80-90% of the workers do have a job by February 2020. So this is, of course, positive news. These workers by now are like 28 years old, and so they have managed, even in the control group, to find some jobs. Then, of course, we see there is a big impact for everyone during the lockdowns. There is some recovery, and then again, the negative effect on employment of the second lockdown, and then a recovery. Now, what we see striking differences between treatment and control group, again, vocational training versus control group, is in the kinds of work that these workers are doing. So again, this is the dependent variable here is whether you work in one good sector, one of these 8 skilled trade sectors. And you see that, again, as I showed you before, big increase in the probability of working in those sectors in 2018. It remains constant. So we still have a large positive effect just before the lockdown in February 2020. Vocational trades are much more likely to work in one of these 8 sectors in 2020. This effect is again in the order of 50% increase, and tracks very similarly what's happening up to wave 4. And then see what happens during the lockdown. This is very interesting. Big negative effect of the lockdown on both types of workers. But if you look at who's losing the most, these are going to be the vocational trainees. The impact of the treatment goes to 0 during the lockdown. There is no more any difference between treatment and control. And then there is a recovery period where, again, everybody's improving a little bit after the lockdown. But again, the vocational trainees are quicker at jumping back. And so the outcomes start diverging again between treatment and control. Then again, second lockdown, there is again a sharp reduction in treatment effects. Actually, the treatment effect goes to 0 completely. The gap closes. So vocational training lose again their advantage. And then again, after the lockdown, they diverge more quickly. So again, we see this pattern of strong, long-lasting effects pre-pandemic, big impacts of the lockdown, especially on vocational trainees, but quicker recovery of vocational training. And we find a similar pattern for earnings again, where if you look at panel B here, this is earnings from self-wage employment. Again, vocational trainees start higher, then they converge during the lockdown. Again, negative effect, especially on vocational trainees, diverge again, and then converge again during the lockdown and diverge again. So we find this pattern of divergence of a quicker recovery of vocational trainees. Of course, I don't have time now to go into details, but I could show you effects now wave by wave of these differences and show you which ones are significant of the previous graphs. Without going into details, the differences that we find for working in one of the 8 sectors and earnings are significant. So just to, for example, if you look at column 5 here, this is the effect on vocational training just before the lockdown of working in one of the 8 skilled sectors. Large positive effect, goes to 0 during the first lockdown, recovers, goes to 0 again during the second lockdown, recovers again. So this is the precise pattern of convergence and divergence between vocational trainees, and we document similar effects for earnings. And of course, then of course the natural question is, okay, but you've told us that vocational trainees lose more during the lockdowns but recover faster. So what happens on net? Well, on net, and here you can look at these column 5, 6, and 7. On net, vocational trainees still do much better over the period of the lockdown. So when we look at the cumulative impacts over the lockdowns period, we see the vocational trainees still made 13 to 16% higher earnings over these periods. So vocational training continues on net to have strong positive effects on earnings during this period of a magnitude that is actually quite comparable to the impact on earning that we were seeing just before the lockdowns. So there is on net positive resilience effects of vocational training. And so in the last few minutes, I'll take about 5 to 7 minutes more. What I want to show you is try to understand a little bit what's happening here. Why is it, the key thing we need to understand is, why is it that vocational trainees lost more during the lockdown periods, but regained more quickly? So here we're going to get at the mechanism section. So really, there are 3 reasons why we think vocational trainees could be more impacted negatively by the lockdowns. And the first is that they might work in sectors that were more impacted. As we know, we've shown we have shifted workers into more stable employment in sectors, skilled trade sectors, and as we know, these were definitely affected by the lockdowns. While the control group is more likely to work in sectors that are more informal, such as agriculture, that was not subjected to the lockdown. It's also possible that vocational trainees were working in jobs that were more affected by the lockdowns. It's possible that maybe firms fired primarily skilled workers during the lockdowns. And it's possible that also vocational trainees have moved and they work in areas that are more impacted by the lockdowns. Maybe they're more likely to live in cities. When we look at why vocational trainees instead recovered faster, again, it could be that the areas, the sectors, or the jobs where they work were quicker in reopening. But it's also possible that vocational trainees have accumulated wealth, have accumulated experience that enabled their job search. And finally, as I said, going back to the roots of what the differences between vocational training and any other more informal types of training is that vocational training is formal, provides certifications, provide transcripts. And so this might make it easier for workers to change job, to find a different job, as they have to scramble for new jobs after the lockdowns. And so we're going to look at each of these possibilities in turn without going into too much detail given the time available. So this is where, starting to understand why vocational trainees were more impacted by the lockdowns, this is where the firm surveys come in handy. So this is the dynamics of employment. So if you just focus on panel B here, this is the dynamics of employment in the firms in the same sectors where the workers are working from our representative sample of SMEs over the period around the first lockdown. So if we normalize employment, the size in February 2020 at 1, you see that there was a sharp reduction in employment during the lockdown. So firms closed and they fired workers during the lockdowns. And there was the workers were actually, they were fired, they were not receiving income here. And then there is some recovery, but if you look at what's happening here, which is about a year after February 2020, so year on year, we still have a decline in employment of about 20% relative to pre-pandemic levels. Again, consistent with the first ILO graph that I showed you, that work hours are going down and they're not recovering fully. So I think this is if you look at this pattern of impacts, this is very consistent with what we see on treatment effects. So we see that, of course, it's consistent with workers, vocational trainees, in fact, working in sectors that were more heavily affected. These sectors were shedding workers during the lockdown. And instead, there is evidence from other studies for example, this paper by Mahmoud and Relay 2022 that shows that agriculture and more informal jobs were much less affected. So they didn't go through such a sharp reduction in outcomes during the lockdown periods. And so again, we think this is part of the explanation that vocational trainees have moved into sectors that had to shut down, that were more heavily affected by the mobility restriction, as opposed to casual labor that was less affected. And so the control group that being more involved in casual labor was also less affected. And then again, it's not just the types of sectors where the workers are working on, it's also the types of jobs that the workers are doing. Here we ask the firms which workers, whether they were more like, whether most workers that left the firm during the lockdown period were skilled or unskilled. And if you look at row number 3 here, 78% of the firms say that most of the workers that left were skilled workers. So the firms are firing skilled workers, and as you know, our workers in vocational training are of course skilled, and so by now, and so this is an extra reason why workers might also have been affected more heavily. The vocational trainees might have been affected more heavily by the lockdowns, and the firms are shedding workers precisely that are skilled workers. We don't find much role for geography. We don't find that vocational trainees are more likely to live in Kampala, for example, where the restrictions might have been more heavily implemented. And so, but then when you look at why workers recovered faster in vocational training, if you look back at this figure, of course, these sectors are reopening. And so, of course, we do expect naturally vocational training to also improve their outcomes. But then is that just what's happening, or is there something more than just the natural reopening of these sectors? And I think there is something more, because if you look here at panel B, we asked the firms, which workers did you fire? And they say they mostly fire skilled workers. 79% of the firms are saying we mostly fire skilled workers during this period. But then we ask, okay, which workers are you rehiring over this period? And only 24% of the firms are saying that they rehire primarily skilled workers. So we're seeing a pattern over the COVID pandemic. The firms are firing skilled workers and mostly rehiring unskilled workers. And so then again, this might put at a disadvantage in the recovery period our vocational trainees because they are skilled. Okay, but there is no impact on geography, there is not much. We don't see impacts on migration, mobility across space, and so on. And so then, again, what can explain then why, even though firms were primarily rehiring unskilled workers, what can explain why the vocational trainees actually recovered faster? We don't find much difference in search intensity, direction. We don't find much differences in the assets or the borrowing behavior of these individuals. And this is consistent with, this is not a good period to open up a business. And so we don't find a lot of the vocational trainees, moving to self-employment, even though they have higher savings pre-pandemic. There's also not much heterogeneity by experience pre-pandemic. So it doesn't really seem that the accumulated wealth or experience of vocational trainees is enabling them to more quickly find other jobs. What we do find instead, that seems to be in line with this fact that vocational trainees recovered faster, is that they experience higher ability to move jobs and to find new jobs after the lockdown. So here, what I'm showing you in column 1 is the dependent variable is a variable that takes value 1 if the worker is employed in the same firm before and after the lockdown. So we're conditioning the sample on being employed before and after the lockdown. And what you see is that vocational trainees, especially during the first wave, which was the one wave that I showed you where people were more affected, the heavier sort of lockdown wave, vocational trainees are less likely to work in the same firm before and after the lockdown. Instead, they're more likely, and then we see that in column 2, to move to a different firm in the same sector. So again, we're showing that vocational trainees, rather than just sort of waiting for that firm to reopen, vocational trainees are moving to other firms more than the control group. And so we think this is suggestive evidence that vocational training might have enabled workers to more quickly move firms. Thanks to the certifiability and the formality of their training, it might be easier for these workers to find another job. And so even though firms are mostly rehiring unskilled labor, vocational trainees manage to jump back more quickly on the job ladder and find other firms find employment in other firms than the original firm where they were working in. And so this is consistent with the important role of labor market mobility in enabling vocational trainees to find work after the economic downturn. So let me just get to the conclusion so I can leave time for questions and discussion. So the one thing that we fundamentally want to do at the end of the day is to understand, okay, but what is the cost benefit analysis of these interventions now that we have 10 years of data? And of course, we have to make some assumptions for this. We have to assume, there are no displacement effects of vocational training to other workers in the economy and some other assumptions. But I think, these are reasonable assumptions, or at least, given these assumptions, we can give a precise estimate of the cost benefit analysis. So on the cost side, we know that this program costs around $500. On the benefit side, we know now, we've been tracking these workers for 10 years. So we know how much money we know the impact of vocational training on earnings throughout this period. And so we can calculate sort of yearly benefits, and then we can discount these benefits to 2012 to calculate an internal rate of return of the program. And assuming only that the benefits last until 2022, we find that an internal rate of return of these vocational training interventions of about 20%, which is a pretty large number. I mean, this is saying that even if you expect the benefits to only last 10 years, these interventions are generating a higher rate of return that is comparable or higher to rates of returns to vocational training interventions estimated in very different contexts, such as Latin America. So these are, this is good news in the sense that vocational training is providing sustained benefits to workers, not only through a period of growth in the economy, but also through a period of economic downturns. And so on net, seems to have a large positive effect on worker outcomes over the life cycle and to have a high internal rate of return. And so just to conclude, to leave some time for questions, again, what have we shown here? We've looked at the long-term impacts of vocational training on youth in Uganda through an RCT, and also looked at the role of vocational training building resilience to shocks. The main results, there are large effects of vocational training in the long run. Vocational trainees are more affected by the lockdowns but recover quicker because they are better able to move between jobs. And so if we look at the policy implications of this, which I think are quite significant, there is a debate on how long the benefits of these interventions extend over the life cycle. And what we're showing here is that vocational training can have positive long-term effects over the life cycle. However, there's something nuanced here in the result, is that, of course, one thing that vocational training is doing is shifting workers across occupations, right? We're moving workers into skilled trades sectors, such as hairdressing, such as welding, such as carpentry. So, of course, in doing that, we might increase exposure to sector-specific shocks, as the lockdowns turn out to be. However, the positive news here is that even though that's happening, vocational training also increases resilience to the shocks by allowing better and faster labor market mobility, so that on net, despite having moved workers into sectors more affected by these shocks, vocational training continues to have positive effects over the long run. And so this is, I think, is very positive news for the role of vocational training for the role that vocational training can have over the life cycle of individuals in lifting individuals out of poverty and putting them on a path towards meaningful remunerative employment and a path to resilience to shocks. Okay, so I'll stop here. Thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to take questions, and I look forward to your feedback. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Vittorio, for the amazing presentation. So we'll move to the questions now. And we have one question from Zainab Parto, and she asks, do you find differences between workers with vocational training and those who are rejected from vocational training in terms of quality of jobs? And there's an additional question, which is, the question goes to understanding whether the key variable that differentiates worker is vocational training, or not simply getting a better job with or without vocational training. That is it the fact that getting a good job is what creates a positive path of higher wages, higher likelihood of employment, etc.? You're muted, Victoria.
Yeah, sorry. No, this is a great question, Zainab. My answer to this is that we've shown that vocational training, as you say, gets people into good jobs, but is that all there is to it, or there is more? I think there is more in two ways. So first, we show that vocational training increases the skills of individuals, right? So this is a key difference between the ones that are rejected from vocational training by lottery and the ones that go through vocational training. And so consistent with that, and I didn't show you here, but we do show this in a previous paper, conditional on working, even conditional on working one of these good sectors, vocational training make more money. And the reason is that they can leverage their skills to do higher quality work themselves. And so, of course, a lot of the payments in this economy, as given the sectors, is piece rate. And so, if you compare workers that do get a job and even workers that do get the same kind of job in the same sector, vocational trainees are earning more money. So because of the skills. So I think there is more to just. So if you think about the policy implications, it's not here. It's not just that we need to get workers into good jobs. Is that you need to get workers the skills that then enable them to get into the good jobs and to earn more money.
Thank you so much. So the next question is from Shubhranka Mondal, who's a policy economist at IGC. How potentially scalable is this program in question?
Yeah, so this is a great point. So a few considerations here, and again, we don't really tackle all of them in this paper. There is, of course, my sense, given again that the program was oversubscribed, there is no shortage, especially in a context like Uganda, of young, unemployed, motivated individuals that would like to go through this training. So that's a first consideration. So we're not sort of at capacity already. Of course, so it is, in sort of on a marginal sense, I think you could definitely, BRAC and it should be very feasible to extend, to scale up this program using a similar method, at least for a while. Then, of course, as you really expand this to the whole country, there are a few considerations that come to mind. Now, the first is that we work with very high quality vocational institutes. And so an open question is, would the returns be similar if you were to involve in the training also vocational training institutes that are not so high quality? And as you expand this, as you say, to the whole country, eventually you would have to start working with vocational trainings that are not as high quality, and so that might reduce the impacts. A second point is that, again, there is no shortage of workers that are motivated to apply, but again, if you scale this up to the country, eventually you might have to start offering this to individuals that are slightly less able or less motivated to take this training, and so that might also reduce the impacts potentially a little bit. And finally, of course, if you really think of extending this to the whole country, there might be general equilibrium effects of these programs that might potentially, I think it's feasible to argue they might reduce the impacts a little bit because, again, as more people get trained, on the one hand, you might think, well, maybe the returns to skills go down. On the other hand, it really depends on labor demand and what this training enables firms to do. So it's a little hard to talk about the general equilibrium effects. So I think, the 2 points, the one point that I think is critical to think about the scalability is to think about, and this is an open area of research, I think, how similar would the impacts be if you involve training centers that perhaps are not as high quality as these training centers. I think that's a key question for future research.
Thank you so much. I also have another question, which is similar to this. Do you think conclusions of this research can be generalized across countries, or do you suggest that it is very specific to Uganda and a similar experiment could be carried out in many different countries to find out what's happening in their case?
No, that's again a great question. I think the results, I think we would find, I think the results generalize quite well to contexts that are characterized by a similar economic environment as Uganda, where you have like no shortage of young, motivated individuals that are credit constrained. So I'm thinking of other sub-Saharan African countries and SMEs in these sectors. Of course, if you as you extend this to areas that are or areas of the world that are less where credit constraints we think are less binding. I'm thinking about middle-income countries or higher-income countries. What happens there is that, typically we think of individuals that really are motivated to get the training. In these countries, it's easier to find scholarships, it's easier to find support. And so the kinds of individuals that have not gotten training are more likely to be workers that maybe would benefit less from this training or not so motivated to get the training. And so I think, it's probably because of this, the returns to these kinds of vocational training would be higher in a developing country where the returns to skills are higher, where there is more binding credit constraints. And other interventions like this have been tried. Of course, we're not the only one to study vocational training. And I think it's fair to say that in higher income countries, the returns tend to be a little lower to vocational training than what we find. And I think this is precisely because of the reasons I mentioned, that the returns to skills is higher in lower income countries. There is a larger pool of individuals that are very motivated, very able to work, but just constrained financially. And so we're really solving that credit constraint. So yeah, this type of intervention might be particularly promising in developing countries and sub-Saharan Africa. I think I am quite confident to say that the results would extend to other sub-Saharan African countries with a similar economic structure as Uganda.
Amazing. So we have another question from another audience. Victor Stephen, he asks, what could be the cause of the non-desirability for vocational trainees going into self-employment?
Yeah, that's a great question. We find a little bit of effects on self-employment, especially in the later waves. So it is true that over time, vocational trainees start to move a little bit more into self-employment, but not much. And I think, it's a little, we don't have a full answer to this, but what I can say is that if you think about, these are young workers that are poor, and they're coming out of vocational training. The vocational training we paid, the vocational training from BRAC. And so, of course, setting up in self-employment might require a startup cost and some fixed cost and some risk that individuals with very low income and very low savings, a baseline, might not be willing to take and not be able to take. And so I think it's a more natural path for them to try to find a job in a firm that doesn't require kind of capital investment and build skills and build savings. And then again, over time, we do see a little bit more starting up in self-employment. So I think this is consistent with a model of sort of credit constraints, again, binding here for individuals and human and asset accumulation over the life cycle that eventually, leads them to start self-employment later. So on your question, if you do ask workers what you want to do, a lot of the workers do say that eventually they want to be self-employed. So they do see the vocational trainees that as the end point. It's just that, again, they're slowly getting there, accumulating the skills and especially accumulating the capital and perhaps the customer base and the relationships in the market that they need before they can do that. And actually, when we look at the, just again on your point, from the sample of firms, if you look at the average age of firm owners, is around 35 to 36 years old. And the average age of workers in these firms is around 27, 28 or 25 even. So again, like remember, in our study period, the trainees are between 20 and 28. So I think it's a natural time to be wage employed. If we could follow them up again in 5 to 7 years, I would expect some of them to become firm owners. It's just a natural sort of life cycle pattern that we see in these economies where you have to accumulate capital before you can start up in self-employment. An open question on your point is, what would be the returns to giving them workers vocational training and startup capital to start immediately in self-employment? That we didn't do, so that we cannot answer. But we would expect them eventually, some of them, to start self-employment, perhaps in their 30s.
Okay, thank you very much for the insightful answer. I have another question for you, which is vocational training can be conducted in a wide range of sectors, and the institutions which intervene have to choose a sector. So has there been research on which sector to choose, which will be more promising and have the best impact on employment and inclusive growth?
Yeah, so this is great. Now, in our context, BRAC did a lot of the market research. So we just evaluate the standard training model that BRAC had been conducting for several years before we showed up as researchers, and they had done precisely the market research that you suggest. So they had studied the local market and understand which are the sectors that are employing workers, the sectors that are either stable or growing, where it's not too hard, let's say, where like a 6-month or 1-year training program could plausibly enable workers to find jobs in. So those are the key characteristics. You want sectors that are sort of labor intensive, they hire workers, but also where the barrier to entry in terms of skill requirement is not too high. For example, Uganda, like I think the last discussions I had with policymakers there, they said, there was, this is a couple of years ago on this question of vocational training, there was big skill gaps in very high skill sectors like oil and gas or engineering. And of course, that's a harder gap to fill for a vocational training program, because you really need to build like engineering skills and oil and gas skills, which might take much longer. And so maybe you need university level training. So I guess the key question for vocational training is what are sectors that are accessible with a 6 or 1 year or sort of a relatively short time of training, but also provide meaningful jobs. And I think, these are, so in this context, these are the sectors. But in other contexts, one would have to think about apply the same reasoning to find sectors that have those characteristics.
Okay, thank you very much, Vittorio. A huge thank you to you for sharing your research with us. And a thank you to all the attendees as well for being with us today. And I would like to remind you that there's a feedback survey at the end of the presentation. So please take a minute to fill that out, as your feedback is very important to us. So we'll end today's session today and look forward to seeing you in the next session. Best wishes from all of us at IGC and PSDRN. Thank you very much.
And thank you everybody for your attention and questions.